What's the most bizarre thing you've seen your neighbor do? I lived in a cul-de-sac, and I used to lean out my window at night and occasionally smoke, watch foxes and rabbits run around, neighbor watch, and so on. Last December at 3 a.m., I poked my head out the window to enjoy the chilly air and look at the full moon. My neighbor across the way was outside in his tidy whities, chain-smoking cigarettes and mumbling to himself. At first I thought he was on the phone, but then he would suddenly jump up, swivel around, stare straight at the spot where he had just been sitting and yell something incoherent. After that, he would sit back down on his stoop and start crying. It became clear that he was having an argument with himself. All of a sudden, he got super calm. He laid down on his back and started swaying his arms and legs in the air like a roach on its back, making airplane noises. He did that for a solid 5 minutes. Then he just lay spread eagle on his stoop for a moment, got up, lit another cigarette, pissed in his yard, and went inside. The whole scene lasted a good 30 minutes. To reiterate, it was December, and he was basically all bare. There was snow on the ground. It was like 25 degrees outside. The same guy also did not understand the concept that if it is dark outside and light inside, then people outside can see you. So I used to watch him pace around his room. One time, I saw him banging this girl, and then all of a sudden they both jumped up and scrambled to get their clothes on. When they jumped up, I recognized the girl as another person who lived in that house. About 12 people lived in that house, and they were all related. The only couple who lived there was the matriarch and patriarch, grandma and grandpa. Everybody else was blood, so that chick was either his cousin or his sister. Story 2. The guy across the street from me lived with his mother and was in his 50s. Really weird guy, very angry and always yelling at me and my family to stay away from his bushes. One night, my friends and I came home at about midnight, and as we turned the corner, our headlights swept across a bare man hunched over in the bushes. We jumped out of the car and started searching for him but could not find him. We did, however, find a stack of corn in the bushes. A couple of minutes into the search, the guy came out of the house in a robe, sweaty and extremely angry that we were in his bushes. We told him what we saw, and he gave us the least sincere, "Oh my gosh, let's look for him." Of course, we never found the bare guy. Story 3, at last, my time to shine. In my small apartment complex, I had a neighbor named Tony who lived in the unit right beside me. He was a retired man in his 70s who, for months, invited an S-worker over. Eventually, Tony fell behind on his payments. What was once an apartment blaring smooth jazz from a boombox suddenly turned into screaming arguments. She would show up past midnight, banging on his door and demanding money, but Tony would not pay. The Los Angeles Police Department showed up on a couple of occasions, and I would wake up in the middle of the night to screaming fights in the parking lot that were so loud that dogs in the usually quiet neighborhood started barking. Eventually, Tony kicked her out, and she was no longer allowed to come back. After that, Tony became increasingly paranoid and reclusive. When I came home from work, I could hear him quietly opening his blinds and staring at me through the window to see who was outside. He told me that if I ever saw the woman near his apartment again, I should just call 911. He would also ask me where he could get a restraining order, but weeks later, Tony invited her back. The boombox was on, and my walls were once again shaking. This time, however, he let her move in. During the days-long move-in, she left her clothes in my parking spot. On top of that, Tony also let the woman borrow his car. I know this because days later, he came up to me, very upset, asking if I had seen his Hyundai. It turned out she had driven off with it. The car was missing for weeks until one day she returned with it, totally wrecked. Without Tony's car, I guess she decided she wasn't going to return the U-Haul truck they had used to move her into the apartment. That truck sat in our parking lot for over a month. I reported the truck to U-Haul, who told me it had been missing for weeks. A representative immediately came over and let all of the air out of the truck's tires. He needed a bigger crew to haul the truck out the next day, so he figured this would buy them some time. With flat tires, you cannot drive the truck, right? I was actually in the parking lot when she came out, inspected the flat tires on the U-Haul truck, got into the vehicle, started the ignition, and with the tires flopping, drove away down the driveway, the bare wheels scraping the pavement the entire way. That was the last time I saw her. Tony was evicted a few weeks later. Story 4. My neighbor is an unemployed man in his 30s who still lives at home with his mother, his girlfriend, and their ever-growing brood. Needless to say, he has a lot of time to kill, which usually results in various odd projects around the house and yard. Out of the many peculiarities, such as using an upright vacuum to clean up leaves from his front lawn, the strangest and most hilarious event we witnessed was when he decided that a huge oak tree in his backyard needed to be trimmed. He was convinced that the leaves were preventing grass from growing, completely ignoring the fact that his numerous kids, dogs, and car parts had turned the yard into a mud pit. He somehow acquired a chainsaw and went to town, cutting off all branches within reach. The next round involved a ladder, and he removed further branches within reach. At this point, he was almost halfway up the tree, but still not done. He could see smaller branches higher up, but could not reach them. A few valiant swings proved they were out of range. He went back inside the house, and we thought that was the end of it until he came back a little while later with a solution. He had duct taped the chainsaw to the end of a broom and duct taped the throttle down after starting it. He climbed the ladder and attempted to cut through the first branch far above his head. The chainsaw immediately detached from the broomstick and dropped past him, just barely missing him while he was on the ladder. Of course, as the throttle was still duct taped down, it was now thrashing about on the ground, kicking up dirt and debris. He descended from the ladder and proceeded to dance around the voracious machine, trying to grab it all while my wife and I stared in disbelief. Fortunately, he managed to get a hold of it from the correct end and turned it off. That was the end of our fun. To this day, we still refer to the incident as the chainsaw dance of death. The tree remains, story 5. I lived on the 8th floor of a large apartment building. My downstairs neighbors always kicked their kids out during the day. They played soccer and other games, but the yelling was really annoying. Yelling, yes, the kids would use the good old field phone, aka a loud voice, to call upstairs, "Mom, Mommy, Mom, 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 Mom," and so on. Eventually, she would call down in a language I was not familiar with. I heard that they were Gypsy. I'm not sure whether Sinti, Roma, or another tribe. As a side note, someone in my building was urinating in the lobby and on the staircase. We thought it was some homeless person who had found our door open at all hours of the day, probably because the kids were outside. We would also encounter their relatives at all odd hours in the elevator. People who seemed to be traveling, carrying plastic bags full of clothing or suitcases. We assumed these were extended relatives of the gypsy neighbors, coming to stay for a night. To be honest, I wouldn't have trusted any of them with $5, let alone let them into the house. But what could you do? We always wondered when we greeted them or even just said hello, why did none of these people ever respond? Is that a gypsy thing? After we moved out, the maintenance staff finally clued us in. The apartment below us was indeed rented by gypsies. Their rent was paid by social services. The mother was strung out on drugs. Consequently, that apartment had become a sort of low-tier gypsy S-work club. That explained why the kids were outside all day, because their mother had company over. Well, at least she was decent enough to spare her kids from the noise, right? But that also explained why the children kept urinating in the stairways, the lobby, and other common areas. They couldn't go inside while mom was entertaining, so they had no choice but to relieve themselves elsewhere. And that was why they had to yell up to the balcony. If their mother answered, they could get information on when they were allowed inside. Our maintenance staff didn't interfere with the kids, even though they were urinating in the hallways. In their words, we don't raise a fuss about the urine. At least they go and relieve themselves in the staircase of the house next door. Not my jurisdiction, not my problem. As for the people we thought were relatives, they weren't. They were seasonal workers, other Roma, illegal immigrants, and so on, who came over for a quick, intimate encounter. No wonder they never acknowledged us when we said, "Have a nice evening." Story 6. There isn't one specific thing, as they seem like regular people and we never really interact with them at all, but my parents' neighbor lives in a massive house and was unemployed when he and his wife, who was also unemployed, moved in. He later trained to become and now serves as a priest in the Russian Orthodox Church. No one knows how they can afford to live in this house. It is literally a mansion. My parents live in a nice neighborhood, but this house absolutely dwarfs all the others on the block. A few months after they moved in, the county district attorney knocked on my parents' door and asked what we knew about these neighbors. When my parents said nothing really, the district attorney told them to be on the lookout for suspicious behavior. The whole thing is really weird, and we suspect some sort of organized crime involvement and/or a money laundering situation. Edit, for those of you suggesting we look into it, the couple moved into the house about 12 years ago, and the district attorney, or whoever it was, showed up a few months later. Since then, nothing has happened. They still live there quietly, and we haven't noticed anything unusual. There are always different cars in the driveway, which I guess could be interpreted as suspicious, but we've never heard any noise or disturbances. They are good neighbors in the sense that they keep to themselves, and we've never been bothered by them or by anything that has or hasn't happened on their property. Story 7. My neighbor regularly sits in his car, which is parked in his garden, and just revs the engine. His father bought him the car years ago, and he has never been able to pass his driving test, so he just revs it. Sometimes he does it for hours. I think there might be something wrong with him. Edit some more information because my inbox is quiet now. The man in question is around 30 to 33 years old. He has had the car for about 6 years. It never moves. It is basically planted in his lawn. He does not work on it and uses it for nothing other than revving the engine for hours. He comes outside in the afternoon, often with a can of beer or something similar, sits in his car and revs the engine excessively for anywhere between 30 minutes and 3 hours. He has clearly given up on his driving test and seems quite content with this routine. It is not about charging the battery. The car serves no other purpose. If you were not using a car for 6 years, you would probably disconnect the battery. Sometimes his little brother comes outside while he is revving the car and cuts up pallets with a saw. That is probably for firewood, but seeing the two of them doing this is really bizarre. Story 8. I'm Filipino and grew up in the suburbs of the Philippines. Once the neighborhood got word that an American family was moving into one of the houses nearby, everyone became curious, especially us kids. We had never seen white people before except on TV. The family was pleasant enough, and we were encouraged not to treat them differently. The kids became our friends, and we played together often. They were just like any other family, but the weirdest thing they did, which I will never forget, happened when the family went abroad in September. They returned in February after they came back. The parents went door to door asking all their neighbors for help. Apparently, since their kids had missed Halloween, they were going to go trick-or-treating in February while wearing costumes. They gave every house candy, which we were supposed to give back to their kids when they came trick-or-treating. We all participated since there was no harm in doing so, and they even gave us extra candy to keep for ourselves, but the image of their kids trick-or-treating in full costume at 9 o'clock in the morning in the middle of February has always stuck with me. I even asked my parents at one point why they were doing that, and I was simply told it's because they're American. Story 9. So, this is actually my parents' story. But they don't use Reddit, so here you go. My parents live on a single-lane dirt road about a mile back into the woods. It was originally strip mining land that my great-grandfather owned and passed down. There are 4 houses on this road, and at one point they all belonged to various members of our family. Now, however, after several deaths, only the 2 middle houses, my brothers and my parents, remain in the family. The first and last houses were sold to unrelated families. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that this is a remote area, and if you're not going to one of those 4 houses, you have no business being on this road. Backstory complete. This story happened about a year ago. The family that lived in the end house, the one furthest from the highway, was having financial problems. The bank foreclosed on their home and they moved away. Fast forward about 6 months, the house was still empty and had fallen into a state of disrepair as the woods began reclaiming the area. It was a weekend night and my dad was out of town on business. My mom was outside boarding up our shed because severe thunderstorms and tornado warnings were expected in the area at any moment. As the first raindrops began to fall, a black car with tinted windows sped past her, almost hitting her, and headed down toward the vacant house. In her words, a large person wearing a black hooded raincoat got out of the car and began wandering around the property. Then they returned to the car, took out a shovel, and started digging in the corner of the yard. By this point, it was raining heavily, and the person was still digging. My mom was watching out the window because she was scared out of her mind. Like I said, this is a remote area, and you pretty much know everyone who should be there, and this person definitely should not have been. This went on for a while, and the person dug a huge hole. Then they went back to the car and pulled out what my mom said looked like a body wrapped in a sheet. They placed it in the hole and started filling it back in. Cue a full-on freakout. My mom called 911, and about 15 minutes later, state police were rolling down the dirt road, which had by then turned into a virtual mud pit. The state police surrounded the vehicle with their guns drawn and had the person in the black hooded raincoat completely contained. This was a one-lane dead-end road, so there was no escape. They took him into custody. A few minutes later, the police came back and informed my mom that the person was actually the old neighbor whose house the bank had foreclosed on. His large dog had died and he wanted to bury it on his old property. He had bought a new car with tinted windows, which was why my mom didn't recognize it, and he hadn't seen her outside, which was why he nearly ran her over. He was too emotionally distraught to realize that digging a grave during severe thunderstorms and tornado warnings at a remote house he had not lived in for several months was a terrible idea, or at the very least, extremely poor timing. Story 10. I was apparently the weird neighbor. Early 20s me bought a house while I was still at university. I mostly had lodgers, but one Christmas I didn't, so it was just me throughout December and January. In January, it snowed pretty badly for the UK, and I hadn't seen snow like that in years. I got excited. I'm a big kid at heart, so I decided to build a snowman. It was fairly late at night, and I had been drinking. I didn't have outdoor lighting in the back garden, so I decided to build my snowman in my small front garden instead. I built a glorious snowman. But then I decided he was a bit dull. Over the next few hours, I dressed him in a variety of outfits: a Viking beard, helmet, and club, a burlesque outfit complete with snow breasts, corset, top hat, and whip, a pirate hat, beard, eye patch, and cutlass, and finally a vampire costume with blood dripping from his fake fangs. I finally got bored at around 1 o'clock in the morning and went to bed. 2 weeks later, the previous snow had melted away, but it was snowing again. As I returned from work, the woman across the street rushed over to ask if I would be entertaining them again that night. I looked confused. Apparently, she and her family had some friends over that first night and had all sat in the dark, watching me and my snowman costume party. She wanted to know if I was planning a repeat performance so she could invite her friends over again. Story 11. My neighbors are a couple who dress the same way I did in middle school. I don't mean to hate on them, they've always been nice to me and my girlfriend, but I can't help thinking that the studded bracelets, the skull wreath on their door, and the Jack Skellington tattoos are a little unusual for people of their age. Maybe it's just me. Regardless, I never had a reason not to like them, so we got along just fine. One day I was taking out my trash and noticed that the guy neighbor followed me down the stairs. No big deal, he could have been doing laundry or something else. I thought nothing of it. When I tossed my garbage in the can, I turned around and caught a glimpse of him peeking around a corner. I walked over and saw him holding a video camera. I asked what he was filming and he said, "You. I'm shooting a horror movie and I wanted to catch you off guard so you wouldn't appear to be acting." I told him that it wasn't really okay to film people in secret without their consent, especially if he planned to publish it in any way. He apologized insincerely, and I let it go under the condition that he not do it again, and that he cut that shot from the movie. Weeks later, he texted me a link to his movie. He never cut the scene. There I was, walking to take out the trash. You can even see me lift a leg and let out a little fart. God damn it. Edit, sorry to be another OP that doesn't deliver, but I couldn't find the link anywhere. It was sent via text, and I never saved it because I really didn't want to watch it again. Story 12. I had some neighbors who I believe were from China, and their 6-year-old children spoke English very, very well. I had also heard the mother speak English fluently on several occasions. One day I was up for work, making coffee in the kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning, when I dropped my cup in shock. The mother was standing on our porch looking into my sliding door. I was clearly angry, opened the door, and asked what she was doing. I noticed she had a basket full of apples from our apple tree in her hands. I tried to ask her politely to stop taking them, but she pretended she couldn't understand me and attempted to walk away. I started yelling and walking after her, and she ran into her house and locked the door. I caught her in the act again about a month later. I told her I was going to call the police, and she immediately dropped the apples in my backyard and ran inside again. Since then, we just glare at each other whenever we cross paths, but she left me alone after that. Story 13. I had an odd neighbor once. We live in a very small town, and this guy was a known crack enthusiast. He inherited his house from his uncle and lived there as if he were a squatter. The day I moved in with the majority of my belongings, he came to my door and asked me to cook him some ramen. My other next-door neighbor saw this and chased him away before I could answer. He warned me that if I did it once, he would never leave me alone. His mother had learned the hard way. In the winter, he would stuff blankets and pillows into the broken windows of his home to keep the cold air out. One year, he decided to put a stuffed animal in one of the broken windows. One night, when we pulled into our driveway, my daughter gasped in fear. I asked her what was wrong, and she just pointed at his house. I saw what she saw, and it did seem a bit alarming. Upon closer inspection, I realized it was just a teddy bear. She still wasn't convinced. In the summer, he would mow his lawn in the middle of the night. I'm a pretty easygoing person, and normally I would have just fallen back asleep after the initial shock of hearing a lawnmower at 2 o'clock in the morning. However, this guy mowed his lawn in 10-minute intervals. Mow for 10, stop for 10, mow for 10, stop for 10. He continued like this for over an hour. If he wasn't mowing, he was hammering his walls. Over time, I learned to tune it out. Also in the summer, he would take baths in a kiddie pool in his backyard. That would have been fine too, but he did it in the middle of the night. Since he lived like a squatter, he had no power, so there were no lights. One night, he came out of his dark backyard wearing nothing but his underpants, and we didn't notice him until he was right beside us. It scared the kids out of their minds. I found it hilarious. The last thing he did before he moved was paint the exterior of his house. He changed his mind about the color so many times that, in the end, it looked like an awkward sunset. The house is vacant now, and I find myself almost missing his weirdness. Story 14. My parents' next-door neighbors are a-holes. The husband constantly walked over into my parents' yard and talked to my mom, completely uninvited, while she was doing garden work, even though she gave no indication that he was welcome there. He also came over and interrupted dinner a couple of times to ask my dad about the property line, and things he claimed to have noticed, for example, when leaves were piling up on my parents' side. And what's the problem? We're not spilling over onto yours. Worst of all, whenever my parents hire anyone to come over to fix or maintain something, landscapers, Comcast, contractors, and so on, the a-hole 9 times out of 10 comes outside while these people are in the middle of their job, sometimes being paid hourly, and asks them to come over to his place to give him a quote, or even start working on his property instead. It eventually got to the point where we all told the a-hole never to come back onto our property again. When I helped my parents do some yard work once, and we were cleaning up near the property line, his entire family came outside just to watch us. The wife flat out stared at us the whole time. I finally had enough and just stared her right back in the eyes. She smiled and waved, and I gave her a thumbs up. Then proceeded to dump some ash a little closer to the property line just to see that smile disappear. Well, once a year, usually in the summer, my neighborhood gets black bears. They usually do not do anything. They are just walking through, looking for food, and being bears. But I swear one year, as this giant black bear was walking through our backyard, I could hear the a-hole yelling from his porch in his heavy Indian accent. "Excuse me, I was wondering if you would like to come over here instead when you have a moment?" The dude seriously has some kind of obsession with getting anyone off my parents' property and onto his own. If I catch this psycho on my parents' property again, I will physically throw him back over onto his. Story 15, finally, my time to shine. We had these neighbors we used to call the McPoyles because they were this oddball family where the adult children lived with their hippie mom, and every single one of them was weird. The mom was eccentric and always wore tie-dye, which is not that weird on its own, but I once saw her vacuuming their front porch. The son had whatever disease gives you dinosaur arms, and the daughter was completely over-the-top steampunk. We once watched them fight each other with samurai swords in their front yard for about an hour, while the mom crocheted in a rocking chair on the porch. It was so surreal, that I genuinely thought I was dreaming at one point. Granted, we were young and had just Jamaican hotboxed our bathroom, so we were high as heck, but it was still insane to watch this dino-human sword fighting his time-traveling sister while his grateful, dead-loving mom played Susie Homemaker. They played chess on the roof once. One time, we watched through their window from our window for a good 30 minutes while they were, as far as we could tell, chasing and trying to trap some kind of critter. The son had a helmet on and a Tupperware container, and the sister had a laundry basket. To this day, I have no idea what they were trying to catch. There is no creature I can think of that could be caught using both of those things. And the cherry on top of the whole thing, they had a room full of birds. Not birds in cages, free-flying burbs, at least 6 or 7 of them. Knowing their house had the same layout as ours, we know that either the adult children shared a room, or someone's bedroom was completely full of birds. Story 16, I was happily enjoying my view one day while having my morning coffee when I spotted someone on the far edge of my property. It looked like they might have been digging, and from that distance I was not quite sure what exactly was going on or who it was. Were they burying a body? Were they planting weed? Were they stealing my plants? What the heck would anyone possibly be digging up right there? I went to my bedroom to put on some clothes, and by the time I got dressed, the shovel-wielding strangers had vanished. I walked over to the neighbors who lived near where I had seen the mystery digging to ask if they had noticed anything. They told me it was them, and that they had planted some pine trees on my property. I asked what type of pines they were and how tall they eventually got, and then pretty much left it at that. Now, aside from the fact that I have long-term landscaping plans that do not include any more friggin' pine trees on my property, I also do not care to have a miniature pine forest gradually overtaking my lake view. I figured I would wait until the offending neighbors returned to their full-time home away from mine before aborting the needled babies they had implanted into my fertile soil without my permission. It was not likely they were going to be watering or checking in on their coniferous infants, so removing the offending timber would have gone largely unnoticed. But before they left their vacation home and before I had a chance to delete the undesired conifers, they returned in the night and expunged their own evergreen contraband. They have not spoken to me since. I'm still confused by the whole thing. Story 17. He was just sitting on the roof next to a leaf blower. He was texting and just sitting there for the longest time. I finally realized he was up there to clean out the gutters, but he sat there forever before actually starting. Lol. I have seen another guy walk up to the car that is parked in the driveway, talk to his reflection, remove his hat, remove his shirt, set it on the car, punch the window, and appear to talk crap to his reflection. Then he put his hat and shirt back on and walked down the street. A few minutes later, he came back up the street and did the exact same thing again in the exact same order. An early 20s kid came outside in a hoodie and shorts last winter during a snowstorm and just stood there pretending to be an airbender for a good 20 minutes. I have a potato-quality Snapchat video of the airbending if this gains any traction. Edit. Here it is. Edit 2. Last year, they served a search warrant on this chick who works there's car and removed a bunch of laptops and also arrested her. She did not come around for about 6 months. Undercover cops are always stopping by in civilian cars and clothes, but they always have their handcuffs and sometimes their sheriff's vests on. A fire truck, ambulance, or police vehicle is there about once a week, but they rarely transport anyone. This guy yelled at me the other day saying, "Hello, how are you?" I responded with, "Good, how are you?" as I walked toward my house, and he yelled back, "I love you, Melissa. Don't leave." Yeah, my name is not Melissa, and I have never seen that guy before. LOL. Anyway, it is a state-run facility of some sort. I have seen some weird things. Story 18. I lived with my grandma for a good chunk of my childhood, and in the house next door to hers, a middle-aged son lived with his very elderly mother. The guy had an almost Amish look to him, but other than that, he seemed pretty normal. For as long as I can remember, though, he cut the grass blade by blade with a pair of scissors. I mean, he would be out there for hours, sometimes. He would cross over a bit into my grandma's yard. There were no fences separating them, and if someone came out during this time, he would full-on sprint back into his house. The mother would drive him everywhere, but they rarely left the house and always bought things in bulk from what we could tell. I tried to get them to buy some of those stupid school-sponsored candy bars once and got to peek inside when the son opened the door. Nearly everything that could be covered in plastic wrap was. When my grandma passed away a couple of years back, I went to help some family with cleaning up the house. The dude was still out in front of his yard cutting grass with a pair of scissors. He looked pretty elderly himself at that point, and I don't think his mother was still around. Made me pretty sad. Weird neighbor, but harmless. Story 19, a few 4th of July ago, while we were shooting fireworks off in the road with some friends, my neighbor sat in a lawn chair in the dark, watching us from inside his garage. Our driveways were awkwardly close, separated by a strip of grass about 4 feet wide. He sat far enough back in his garage that we questioned whether he could even see the fireworks at all. He just sat there, didn't say a word, and didn't come out until we went back inside. A few minutes later, we noticed he was out there shooting fireworks off by himself. He has a wife and 2 kids. Just him, alone in his driveway. The other day, I came home while he was mowing his lawn. He immediately stopped and quickly walked over to the opposite side of the house, staying there until I went inside. I waited inside for a few minutes until I heard the mower start back up. Sure enough, when I walked back out, he did the same thing again. He wasn't even going to quench his thirst on that hot day, even though his Gatorade was sitting on top of his car. I don't know. He's just a weird dad neighbor, and I honestly don't know how to handle him. Awkward. We're nice people, damn it. Story 20 man, my neighbor Ray was a hoot. One time, my roommates and I were watching Dexter when all of a sudden we hear a boom, and our house shakes. One of my roommates just says, "Tree fell on the house." We run outside and see our neighbor Ray, right across the street, standing in his yard with a garden hose hanging out of his right hand. Ray is staring straight up at this giant 20 to 25 foot towering flame. We yell, "What the hell, Ray?" He turns and says, "Sorry, was just trying to get rid of some old gas and these dead logs in his yard." We all just stand there for a moment, admiring the towering inferno, when all of a sudden we hear a fire truck in the distance. It pulls up to Ray's house, and Ray walks up to the driver like, "Sorry, just burning some old gas." The firemen just kind of slumped in their seats, took off their headscarves, and drove off. That was one Ray story. Another time we are in the house and hear a loud gunshot go off. Naturally, we run outside, and Ray comes running over to our house with a gun. "What the hell, Ray?" Ray immediately says, "Holy crap, guys. I'm so sorry, my buddy brought a silencer over and we shot the gun at the ground. It doesn't friggin' work." Keep in mind, Ray's backyard isn't fenced off. This is a residential neighborhood right across from a college campus. Ray ruled, super nice guy, just a neighborhood psycho we all liked. He also used to own the raddest skate shop in town. He even had a boat in his front yard he was restoring, but we would just climb into it and get really drunk all the time. Story 21. I had an odd neighbor for a long time. He would almost always be on his front porch when I got home, greeting me with a drawn-out, "Hey neighbor," as I basically bolted to my front door. He was a slightly overweight man with a terrible stutter. The conversations that followed his catchphrase were always too difficult to keep engaged with. The scenes I recall were from a few years ago, during the very hot summer of 2012. I got home, parked, and began the usual sprint to my front door. My neighbor, Mr. Lilly, was saying something about, "We need to do something about this heat." A few days later, it was unbearably hot. Once I got home, I parked my car as usual and bolted to my front door. I had the air conditioner blasting within seconds, as any normal person would. Then I walked outside to my backyard to water my garden. Our backyards were shared, Mr. Lily's and mine. I just wanted to water the garden and escape back inside. That was all I was concerned about, so I was caught off guard when I suddenly heard, "Hey, neighbor, want to come swim in my pool?" I looked over to his yard and will never forget what I saw. Mr. Lilly was standing in a little kid's inflatable kiddie pool, a pool only big enough to keep his feet wet. The only scrap of clothing he had on was a yellow banana hammock. Almost everything else of his was hanging out. 2 days later, he went to refill his pool, but left the hose on and wandered off. He would put on his high-visibility shirt, grab his walker, and roam all over town. When I got home, my yard was completely flooded. Story 22. My next-door neighbor, an elderly lady, used to dress up in shabby clothes and a hat, pull a shopping cart out of her garage, and go trash picking and recycling hunting whenever we put our cans out. My cans were always her first stop. I wouldn't have noticed this, because a lot of people do this in my neighborhood, but one day I went out to toss something in the recycling bin after the cans were already on the street, and noticed that all my aluminum cans were gone, and an abundance of empty liquor bottles had appeared. I started watching from my window to solve the mystery, and sure enough, every week she would don this silly getup, trundle out her cart, and stow her booze bottles in my can instead of hers. She also used to come to my door and insist that I was hoarding her mail. She would even ask to come in and look through papers she had spied on my dining room table, giving me the out that maybe I hadn't noticed I had her mail. When she passed away and her son opened her garage, the whole place was packed with recycling and junk she had pulled out of the trash over the years. I wondered how much of it came from my can and how much of my mail might have been in there. Story 23. Before I moved away, somebody bought a ton of houses in my neighborhood and converted them into halfway houses. They were not the fancy kind, with palm trees out front and names like Horizons. These were the kind where they crammed more people into dilapidated houses than legally allowed, let the yards overgrow, and provided no real supervision for the residents. I have lots of stories, just a few. A lady came outside in the afternoon to have a drunken argument with someone on the phone, but she forgot to put on pants or underwear. She did this several times. A man would walk door to door in the neighborhood every single day, asking people for cigarettes. Another man would peer through holes in our fence, and if our dog was back there, usually sleeping or playing, he would make mocking, barking noises at it. Eventually, the dog would get upset and start barking back, and then he would knock on our door to complain that our dog was barking. One man dug a giant hole in the backyard, which had to have been at least 12 feet by 12 feet, and buried hundreds of car batteries in it. Why? I have no idea. A lady went outside early one morning and attempted to stuff her breast inside her mailbox. Story 24. I walked out my front door at 5 a.m. and saw him crouched down behind the bushes dividing our front lawns. I think I spooked him because he sort of just stood up and walked awkwardly back into his house. He could not have really been doing anything because he was not wearing gloves, did not have dirty hands, and had no tools. I also see a lawn care service come by and take care of his yard. so it is unlikely he was doing any of that himself. He is probably about 45 to 50 years old and never responds when I say hi, but I can always hear loud metal music coming from inside his house. I think he works out of town or something, because I can go for weeks or even a month without any sign of him, and then suddenly I will see him a couple days in a row. If I ever go missing, 100% this guy is behind it. Just a super weird dude. Story 25. I have so many stories about one of my neighbors, but I will stick to this one. I was in high school and was having a beginning of the year bonfire with a bunch of my friends. Two of my friends showed up and walked toward the back. They found me and told me that my neighbor was hanging out of his truck. I went to look, and my neighbor was literally flopped over with his upper half out of the car, still in his seatbelt. I ran and got my dad and told him what was going on. He ran over, ready to call 911. He continued to shake him, screaming his name. My neighbor finally came to and said, "Oh, I was just relaxing." He grabbed his dirty 30 and waddled inside. Sadly, this was not the only time this happened. We had someone knock on our door at 7 a.m. to tell us that he was lying face down next to his running lawnmower. His explanation, it was just a nice time for a nap. I wish I could keep going, so many good stories. Story 26. This happened in the spring of 2001. I was a teen and so were my brothers. We moved out of Pittsburgh into a new to-us home in Pennsylvania. We had about one cleared acre. Right next door was another house of similar size with roughly the same amount of yard. All the other neighbors were out-of-sight farms. The first several times I was at the house, I did not see any activity next door, being that the place was run down and had piles of stuff all over. I figured it was abandoned. Then we actually moved in, and I learned how wrong I was. My first time experiencing the neighbors was when a gargantuan lady in a halter top and Daisy Dukes brought a veritable gaggle of children outside. I did not want to look, but I heard her scream at one of the children to, "Get your A back in that mud puddle with your sister." We immediately named them the Mud People. My second time experiencing the neighbors, my brothers and I were doing yard work while our stepdad drank beer and harassed us from the porch. My brother was complaining about picking up trash that blew over from their yard when my stepdad said something like, "Well, maybe they have a hot daughter who could make it worth it to you." My brother immediately fired back sarcastically, "Yeah, and there she is." About 3 seconds later, their front door opened and a shirtless man with a large beer belly and Duck Dynasty beard walked out. He was now the hot daughter. We would play hide and seek in the woods. They would come out onto their back porch and throw canned goods at us. Jokes on them. Our parents did not always buy enough food, and they always ate their fill without regard for what was left for us. This led to an increase in hide-and-seek sessions. After a while, the neighbors must have really gotten pissed because they started brandishing firearms. Hide-and-seek stopped. They got chickens, 2 hens, and a rooster. That rooster never shut up, probably because they were living in a fiberglass truck cap about 5 feet from the road. That truck cap really intensified the sound. The house was probably the nicest house I lived in as a child. Definitely had the strangest neighbors I have yet experienced. Story 27. About a week after we moved in, a cop knocked on our door asking our names and whether we knew so-and-so. I told the cop our names and explained that we had just moved in, so I did not know who he was talking about. Apparently, our next-door neighbor had called the police because a FedEx package arrived at her door. It supposedly did not have her name on it, and she thought we had sent it to her just to screw with her. She also claimed that one of us had been sitting in our car at the end of her driveway. That same neighbor has been stalking us ever since we moved into our house. But this was the creepiest thing she has done as far as stalking goes. I went on a trip for a few weeks, and sure enough, as soon as I got back to the house and started getting my things out of the car, she came out of her house. She stared at me as she got into her car and began driving super slowly in front of my house, just staring in my direction. Also, she has about 20 fake geese in her front yard. Like, why? Story 28. Maybe not that weird, but definitely out of the norm. The house next to me always seems to be rented to very large, low-income Mexican families. The last family that lived there set up a giant bird cage in their backyard for breeding and selling birds. We have very large groups of lovebirds that live in our neighborhood, and I noticed that I had not seen them in a week or two, even though I could still hear them every day. I looked into my neighbor's yard and noticed approximately 40 to 50 lovebirds crammed into a few cages. Now, the good part, I went over to the neighbor's house and asked him why he had all of those lovebirds trapped in cages, and he said that he bought them from someone, likely Story. I then went to my across-the-street neighbor and asked her if she had noticed anything. She told me that my neighbor had mentioned to her that he trapped a few birds. We asked the neighbor again to release the birds, which he refused. About a week later, it seems that someone broke into his backyard while he was at church and released all of the birds back into the trees. Story 29. Old neighborhood. The neighbors who moved out of their home into a rental 30 minutes away, also farther from their jobs, which cost more than their mortgage for less space. Both living and otherwise, all in the name of saving money. They never listed their house for sale and never shut off the utilities, including cable, only to move back in 2 years later. When I moved, the payments were in arrears and foreclosure was on the horizon. The same neighbors also tried to remove large stumps, 5 feet or more in height, and a minimum of 10 feet in diameter, from trees planted more than 100 years ago using a Toyota truck. We had another neighbor who would chase speeders through the neighborhood and try to detain them until the cops arrived. One cop finally got tired of him playing police officer and arrested him on an unlawful detainment charge or something similar. He quit after a hefty fine and a stern warning from the judge. Admittedly, I was a weird neighbor as well. I used to sit in my car for 2 hours every night. In the winter, I would turn the car on for 15 minutes at a time to heat it up, then shut it off. I know many people speculated about what the middle-aged neighbor lady was doing every night. Few knew I was enjoying a little grass to help me sleep. New neighborhood, the guy who stands on his front porch several times each night yelling, "Come here, dumb, eh?" I cannot figure out if he is calling his wife, his children in their late teens, or his dog that, or all three. Story 30, what hasn't he done? If I'm out front on the porch with friends or family, he will open his front door, hold his cat up to the screen door, and just stare at us. He has a Corvette and really likes the sound of it. One time he was doing yard work while I was out watering some plants, and this is what he did. He took the cover off his Corvette, grabbed something from the trunk, started the Corvette for about 30 seconds, turned it off, went inside, came back out a minute later, and did it again. Or he would sit in his car. This repeated for about 30 minutes straight. I could keep going, but those are the two craziest examples. Oh, and there was the time I had to call the cops because every time I left my house, he would come out of his and walk toward me. I would go back inside, and he would stop and go back into his house. I would go out again, and the same thing happened. This repeated 2 or 3 more times. All of this was because I would not turn my porch light off at 5 at night in November. I was raking leaves, and it was getting dark. Story 31. Oh boy. So, mine asked his girlfriend and her daughter to move in with him and his wife. The wife obviously did not like that, so she put a shotgun shell in her mouth in the middle of the field by our house. The last I heard, she was a vegetable in some hospital, but I'm sure she is gone now, unfortunately. A couple of years later, he drove his SUV into our kitchen with the girlfriend and stepdaughter along for the ride. Screw them. They both sued him, bought new cars with the money, and then kept living with him. He nearly offed my mom and my dog in the process, and this was not the first time he had driven into someone's house. Fast forward a while later, and I drove by and saw the stepdaughter, no longer living there, wearing a wedding gown, crying her eyes out, unloading things from her car into the garage. Not too outrageous, but definitely a little weird. This all happened over the course of maybe 10 years. Not a single time that we spoke with him did he not have alcohol on his breath. Down the road, we noticed a private van from my city's public transit system parked there all the time. No, he did not lose his license and need to be driven around. He retired and became a driver for the bus system. Story 32. My wife and I lived in a small apartment complex. One night, we heard this terrible shrieking. It was past midnight, and we could not tell if it was a person or an animal. Then we heard someone racing through the corridor, screaming like a banshee. He ran up another level and began wailing on our upstairs neighbor's door. He was howling, then suddenly stopped to belt out, "Water, please, just a glass of water," all while pounding on the door. Another neighbor calmly asked him to be quiet. The guy, who we later came to realize was actually our neighbor as well, was extremely excited that someone was willing to talk to him. "Oh, thank God, water, please, just a glass of water." "Be quiet," the rational neighbor said before closing the door. The wild neighbor shrieked in despair at his misfortune and continued running to random doors, knocking hysterically and begging for water. Naturally, between the screaming and the door pounding, the police were contacted. By the time they arrived, the wild neighbor was seated in a full lotus position across the street, wearing only boxers. When the police approached, he collapsed and said, "Thank God you're here. Can I please have some water?" The police quickly realized this guy was on something and proceeded to restrain him. The screaming resumed until they managed to get the poor fella into a car and shut the door. The next day, we found his clothes scattered among the bushes and a bottle of orange juice sitting on the steps. He had dropped his juice, and I suppose his trip took a bad turn. Later, the guy returned and resumed a regular routine of very vocal Tai Chi, yoga, Scientology, or whatever it was, where he would howl out mantras, do stretches, ring a little gong he carried all the time, and argue loudly with his girlfriend. Story 33. Not too weird, but I used to live across the street from a park. We would occasionally have wandering ducks come into our yard, and we thought nothing of it. Well, my neighbor had the idea to put up a little kiddie pool for one particular duck he named Quackers. It was a very territorial duck, so that first week was a little rough, considering I had a ball of feathered fury coming at me every time I went to class in the morning. Then the duck chilled and became our alarm clock for about a month. 6 a.m. On the dot, the a-hole would go ballistic with the noises. I felt bad when he died, though. I knew there was a fox in the neighborhood, and I never thought to put two and two together to tell my neighbor that Quackers might not be safe. I got up to go to class one morning and saw a mess of blood and feathers. Poor Quackers had been mauled by the fox. My neighbor got pretty depressed after that. I do not think we have talked since. I also have considerably less wholesome stories about my methy neighbors who legitimately barked at each other, but that is a whole other can of worms. Story 34. We bought a house that turned out to have crazy crackhead neighbors. There are so many stories, but I will tell one that sticks out. The house was foreclosed upon, and the lady's nephew was there and upset about it. His grandfather had built that house. Apparently, he had helped his now-dead grandpa plant the 2 trees in front of the house. I watched as he dug up one of the trees, which was at least 2 stories tall but thin. Next thing I saw, he was strapping it to the top of his small Kia like it was a freaking Christmas tree. Seriously, this thing was more than twice the size of his car. As he was pulling away, vowing to come back for the second tree, my friends pulled up to witness this spectacular event. For days, they had a massive hole in their front yard. Suddenly concerned about safety, the aunt decided to fill in the hole. They just threw a bunch of stuff in there. The dude never came back for the second tree. I'm still wondering what happened to the first tree. I doubt he ever planted it. Story 35, we had a small farm pond with half a dozen 6-inch koi in it. We fed them once a day. We went on a 3-day vacation and left a vacation feeder in the pond. They probably did not even need it, but what the hell. We came back after the trip, and all of the koi were gone. We thought maybe a cat got to them or an owl or something. But then 2 days later, the neighbor came over with a little trash bag containing a couple of gallons of water and all of our koi. She said she did not know how long we were going to be gone, so she took them to keep them company and make sure they were well fed and looked after. Lady, what the heck? You do not steal somebody's fish just because they are away for a couple of days. What the hell is wrong with you? My parents had a good talk with her about boundaries while I put the poor koi back into their pond. Luckily, they all survived. Story 36. Maybe 10 years ago, the people renting the house next to us were a young couple in their 20s who had their first kid while in high school, and then had 2 more since. All of the kids were under 10. For some odd reason, the kids were forbidden from using the toilets in the house, so they would have to defecate and urinate in the yard. Seeing the neighbor kid squatting in the yard taking a dump one day during lunch was definitely one of the oddest things I have ever seen. The parents eventually lost custody and got in trouble for neglect, but it took a month or 2 for us to figure out what was going on since we initially thought they were just not picking up after their dog, the excuse they used. Story 37. I used to live in an apartment complex and had this weird neighbor downstairs. He was an older man. I think he had a wife who lived with him who would walk around topless, and he had the biggest pot belly I had ever seen. I would be out on my balcony in the summer, and he would come out and talk to me from his yard below, but he would make creepy comments about how I was wearing a dress and that he was looking up at me. When I would walk my dog along the outskirts of the parking lot, he would slowly follow me in his car, hoping to maybe chat with me. But I would try to avoid him. Lastly, he bought a riding lawnmower and would cut the grass in the area that bordered the parking lots. We were not responsible for the upkeep of the grounds. There was a young tree in the middle of the lot that I enjoyed, and one day I went out there and it was gone. He had cut it down. That made me sad. Story 38. My neighbor in his 90s is a very active old man. He used to be the sheriff and owns tons of land, so he just bales hay during his retirement to keep from getting bored. He is blind as a bat and country as can be. One day we glanced out the door to our side yard, which is just 2 big glass doors. We saw him lying down, half under his tractor, not moving in 90-plus-degree sun. We thought for sure he was dead. We called the ambulance, rushed out there, and could not wake him. The first responders arrived, managed to get him to wake up, and got him inside to cool off. The first thing he said was, "I was napping. Let an old man sleep." Story 39. Back when I lived in Mississippi, I had always had absolutely terrible neighbors in the rental property next door. But one family in particular was truly exceptional in the worst way. Cops were at their house all the time, trash was scattered everywhere in the front and backyards, and their kids even stole things from my shed. Anyway, I had a very large tree in my front yard that was struck by lightning one summer. Half of it fell directly between our 2 houses, and the other half was leaning slightly toward my neighbor's yard. I watched this guy and his kids push an old, broken-down car that had been sitting in their yard for years right underneath the leaning tree, all while I was standing there in my yard watching. The guy even looked at me and said, "That crap better not hit my car, dog. If it does, you're gonna pay up." I called a tree cutting service, and they removed the tree. He got absolutely nothing from it. However, in the end, I did eventually get the guy arrested and evicted for severely abusing a pit bull he had chained up in the backyard. When the canine cop showed up at his house, I genuinely thought he was going to off that guy on the spot. It was absolutely glorious. I had a lot of bad neighbors there, but that family was without a doubt the absolute worst. Story 40. When I was about 8 years old, I was getting ready for bed when I heard a commotion outside. I looked out my bedroom window just in time to see my neighbor running as fast as she could from her front door across the yard. Her husband quickly caught up to her after about 50 feet, grabbed her by the hair and dragged her screaming back into the house. I ran downstairs and told my parents, "John is beating Jane. I just saw him grab her by the hair and she was screaming." My mom wasn't convinced. "Are you sure they weren't horsing around? Like I do with Daddy sometimes? Are you sure she wasn't laughing?" "No, she was screaming, and he was dragging her by the hair," I insisted. My parents decided to call the police. They told them they weren't certain anything had happened, but someone should check on the neighbors just in case. I went back up to my room to watch out the window. When the police knocked on the door, I found out later, the neighbor's husband told her to answer and make them go away. Instead, she opened the door, all but collapsing into his arms while crying, and said, "I'm not sure how you knew to come here. I thought my husband was going to off me tonight." Story 41. My neighbor had a large tree in his garden. One day, he decided to saw off a branch that probably weighed half a ton. He tied a rope to the branch, slung the rope over a higher branch, and then tied the other end around his petite wife, instructing her to lower the cut branch slowly when it began to fall. We watched fascinated as he climbed the tree and proceeded to saw. Realizing that he actually intended to go through with it, my husband leapt over the fence and grabbed hold of the woman, fearing that she could be sent flying through the air at any moment. The neighbor sitting up in the tree yelled at him to let go of his wife. Story 42. My neighbor had a malignant brain tumor. He was a nice guy, but you could tell that things were a little off. Near the end of his life, he began bringing rocks into his backyard, big ones, weighing 15 to 20 pounds each. He carried them one by one through the narrow alley between our houses and stacked them in the backyard. I think he said he wanted to make something out of them, like a rock garden or some sort of project. Everyone else, his family, the neighbors, knew that it really didn't make much sense. But who's going to tell a man with only months to live that he shouldn't do something that makes him happy? He passed away before he could start his project. So there was just a pile of rocks in the backyard. His family eventually moved, leaving it to the next family living there to dispose of the rocks. It took about a year. Story 43. My house was the last one on a dead-end road. My neighbor to the right had a beautiful 7-acre lot, completely smothered in trees. It looked like a miniature forest. My neighbor once told me that he was a bird watcher, so he had planted those trees, over 200 different types, to attract various birds. One day it was pouring down heavy rain. I was probably about 7 years old, and of course I had to sit and stare out the window. I watched as my neighbor walked down the road all the way to the end, binoculars in hand, facing toward me. He stayed out there for a very long time. I remember thinking to myself, what kind of bird would be out in a storm like that? Story 44. My next-door neighbor, who was about 40, had a dog she didn't really like. She never looked after him properly or walked him much, so he became a real menace, constantly destroying things. When the dog eventually died, she got a new one, except it was the exact same breed with the same name, the same collar. And she treated it poorly just like the first one. There's also a sadder story. One day, another neighbor and I found a stray cat that was practically dying of starvation. We took it to the vet, bought it medication, fed it well, and tried to nurse it back to health. Then, one day, another neighbor, oddly enough, a friend of the first lady, came and screamed at us. Apparently the cat belonged to her, and she wanted it to live off nothing but lizards. I think she even threatened the kind neighbor who had helped care for it. We tried to keep feeding the cat, but she must have locked it up or prevented it from coming back. Eventually, it died of starvation. Story 45. I have an I don't care attitude when it comes to what I'm doing, what I'm wearing, or how weird it looks to others when I'm in my yard. So, if my neighbor has read it and has posted in this thread, I'm probably the reference. I garden at midnight quite often. I'll also lay a blanket in the yard and watch the stars and the moon for a couple of hours, sometimes even falling asleep. I'll crawl around chasing my cat just because it annoys her in that funny cat way. On days off, I'm probably not wearing underwear or a bra. I also have my comfortable day-off attire, which consists of the same pair of shorts and shirt or a loose dress with no bra, so my neighbors probably think I own just these 3 things and nothing else. I will talk to almost any animal I see, including dogs 2 yards away. Yeah, my neighbors probably talk about me. Story 46. We were the neighbors. My sister was writing a book in which the hero drives his truck through the villain's living room wall, pulls the girl into the cab, and drives away. I called BS on the truck being drivable after going through a wall. After some argument, it was decided that we needed to test this, Mythbusters style. We already had a truck on its last legs, all we needed was a wall. So my sister called her husband, explained the situation, and asked if he could build a wall big enough to drive through. He agreed on the condition that he drive the truck. Let me pause to state for the record. We were living in Kansas at the time. None of us had a history of deranged behavior. It's just Kansas. Kansas gets to you in you anyway. My brother-in-law spent the next week constructing a wall on the concrete pad where the previous owners used to park an RV. He had built homes before, so he made the thing to code. We were aware of the neighbor's interest. It's a quiet neighborhood, not much to do except watch through the curtain as your shirtless, beer-drinking neighbor erects a single, freestanding wall for no reason, up to and including painting it. Saturday morning, we all went outside to admire it. My sister drove in a nail and hung a picture for Kansas-related reasons. The neighbors, noticing the 3 of us clustered around the wall, correctly deduced that something was happening and boldly came onto the porch to watch. My brother-in-law waved as he went to start the truck. My sister and I got well out of the way. The truck came through that wall like the Kool-Aid Man. It definitely hit a few 2x4s, but by God, it drove away. My sister and I shook hands and went back inside. My brother-in-law threw the remains of the wall into a dump trailer and also went inside. Our neighbors put their house up for sale 2 weeks later. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.